Welcome to Narrative Nights. Step into a world of mystery, intrigue, and suspense. At Narrative Nights, we bring you thrilling detective stories that will challenge your mind and keep you guessing until the very end. Before we begin, we'd love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from? Drop a comment and let us know which part of the globe you're watching from. We're all united by the love of a good mystery. Let the investigation begin.
The Christmas Charade. Chapter 1. An Invitation to Christmas. It was the sort of Christmas that seemed to have been lifted directly from the pages of a storybook, a fact that did not escape the notice of Miss Jane Marple. From the warm interior of her nephew's motor car, she observed the passing countryside with a quiet, bird-like attentiveness. A thick, immaculate blanket of snow lay over the fields and hedgerows of Kent, muffling the world in a profound and peaceful silence. On the window panes, Jack Frost had been at his intricate work, etching feathery patterns of ice that glittered in the pale afternoon light. The drive from St. Mary Mead had been a long one, and Raymond West, gripping the steering wheel with the intense concentration of a modern man grappling with treacherous country lanes, cast an occasional, affectionate glance at his aunt. "You're quite sure about this, Aunt Jane?" he asked, his voice a familiar mixture of concern and indulgence. Harriet Weatherby's idea of a proper Christmas can be rather strenuous. His wife, Joan, seated beside him, turned to smile at the small, upright figure in the back. "Raymond just means Harriet is likely to have organized us all into playing charades before we've even had a sherry." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "It is very kind of Harriet to invite us. And Christmas, my dear, ought to be spent in company. One sees so much of human nature at a gathering like this. It is often more instructive than a quiet evening by one's own hearth." "I'm not sure I share Harriet's enthusiasm for recreating the past," Joan admitted, her gaze returning to the snowy landscape. "She sounded so determined on the telephone. As though she were staging a theatrical production." "Harriet was always one for tradition," Miss Marple agreed softly. "She likes things to be just so. It gives her a sense of order." As if on cue, Weatherby Manor came into view. It was a handsome Jacobean house, its red brick and dark timbers stark against the snow, nestled atop a gentle rise. Smoke curled lazily from its many chimneys, promising warmth and welcome within. At that moment, the great oak door swung open, and a figure emerged, swathed in a fur coat that spoke of considerable expense. "Oh, how wonderful!" a voice boomed across the crisp air, and Mrs. Harriet Weatherby began to make her way down the stone steps with the determined gait of a ship's captain navigating a tricky swell. "Charles was beginning to think you'd turned back. He has no faith in modern motor cars." Raymond brought the vehicle to a gentle halt. "We wouldn't miss a Weatherby Christmas for the world, Harriet," he said with a smile, climbing out to assist his wife. Harriet linked arms with Miss Marple, her cheeks ruddy from the cold, her expression one of beaming satisfaction. "I do believe this will be just like the old days," she declared, leading her friend up the steps. "A full house, a proper feast, and the most wonderful company." Miss Marple smiled politely. It was a sentiment so often expressed at Christmas time, but in her experience, rarely achieved without complication. The entrance hall was a cheerful riot of holly and ivy, the air thick with the scent of pine needles, roasting chestnuts, and beeswax. A towering Christmas tree stood sentinel in a corner, its branches glittering with tinsel and glass ornaments. From a room beyond came the murmur of conversation and a sudden peal of laughter. Come in, warm yourselves." Harriet fussed, as a uniformed maid scurried forward to take their coats. "Charles is sulking in the library, of course. Pay him no mind. You know how he is about guests." As they were ushered into the drawing-room, Miss Marple took in the assembled party with a single, comprehensive glance. It was a habit so ingrained as to be second nature. Near the roaring fire stood Major Edward Strickland, a tall, spare man with a soldier's bearing and grey-flecked hair. His wife, Violet, a delicate, dressed-in-china woman with anxious eyes, hovered beside him, her fingers worrying the folds of her silk dress. Seated somewhat apart was their son, Henry, a studious-looking young man utterly engrossed in a book, his posture suggesting a desire to be invisible. Near the window, framed by heavy velvet curtains, stood a couple whom Harriet introduced as Mr. and Mrs. Chat-Ton. He was a tall, thin man with a watchful, rather reptilian stillness, while his wife possessed a striking, dark beauty and a smile that, Miss Marple noted, did not quite reach her eyes. And then there was the master of the house. Charles Weatherby sat stiffly in a large armchair, scowling into a glass of brandy. He was a man of firm opinions, most of them negative, and acknowledged their arrival with a grunt that was barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Raymond, undeterred by this chilly reception, greeted him cordially. "Charles, good to see you. How is retirement treating you?" "Peacefully," Charles said shortly. "Until now." Harriet let out a forced, tinkling laugh. "Oh, Charles, dear, must you be such a bear? It's Christmas." Charles merely muttered into his brandy. Miss Marple, however, found his displeasure rather specific. It was not the general irritation of a man whose quiet life has been disturbed. There was something else in the way his gaze flickered towards the Chat-Tons, something wary and resentful. The evening progressed with the practiced ease of a well-rehearsed play. Harriet was the perfect hostess, ensuring glasses were filled and conversation never flagged. Major Strickland recounted a rather long story about tiger hunting in India, his wife watching him with an expression of indulgent distraction. At one point, Raymond, ever the man of letters, noticed young Henry's absorption. "Something thrilling, I presume?" he asked pleasantly. Henry looked up, startled, as though pulled from a great depth. "It's a detective story," he admitted, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. "A jolly good one, actually." "Oh?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Which detective is it?" "Lord Peter Wimsey," he replied. Harriet, passing with a tray of spiced wine, wrinkled her nose. "Detective stories. Frightful things. I simply can't abide them." Miss Marple said nothing, but she observed the almost imperceptible way Henry's fingers tightened on the cover of his book. Outside, the wind had begun to rise, rattling the window frames. The snow was falling again, no longer in gentle flakes but in a thick, determined curtain. The festive cheer, the crackling fire, the polite conversation, it was all very charming. But people, Miss Marple knew, had a way of bringing their troubles with them, packed away as neatly as their evening clothes. And as her sharp blue eyes moved from face to face, she could not shake the feeling that beneath the pleasant veneer of this Christmas party, trouble had already found its way to Weatherby Manor. Chapter 2: The Gathering Storm. Outside, the wind had begun to howl in earnest, no longer a mere whisper but a mournful cry that swept across the whitened landscape. It rattled the old leaded panes of Weatherby Manor and sent powdery flurries of snow skittering against the glass, blurring the world beyond into an indistinct swirl of grey and white. The house, for all its solid stone and ancient timbers, seemed to answer the storm with creaks and groans of its own, the sound of old wood settling ever deeper into the frozen earth. A great storm was brewing, and it was clear they were all to be its prisoners. Within the drawing-room, the fire crackled a cheerful defiance, its golden light dancing over polished mahogany and the faces of the guests. And yet, the warmth seemed only to penetrate the surface. Miss Marple, a cup of tea balanced in her delicate hands, observed the room with her customary quiet attention. The scene was pleasant enough, the soft candlelight, the murmur of conversation, but there was a distinct feeling of an approaching front, and it had nothing to do with the weather. She noted the way Charles Weatherby's fingers were curled so tightly around his brandy glass that his knuckles showed white. His dark, unreadable gaze would flicker, every now and again, towards Mr. Chatton, who, in complete contrast, lounged with an air of languid ease, his expression one of faint amusement. Near the fireplace, Major Strickland maintained his rigid, military posture, his face a neutral mask that seemed to require a considerable effort to maintain. His wife, Violet, sat beside him, her slender fingers twisting a rope of pearls at her throat, a constant, nervous gesture, as if the cool, smooth beads offered some deep and necessary comfort. It was only their son, Henry, who seemed entirely at ease, lost as he was in the fictional perils of his detective novel. "Christmas is not what it once was," Miss Marple remarked at last, setting down her teacup with a small, distinct clink. Her voice, though soft, had a carrying quality that gently snagged the attention of the room. Harriet Weatherby glanced over, momentarily diverted from her duties as hostess. "Oh, I don't know, Jane. I'm doing my best to keep up standards." "Oh, you are, my dear, and very well, too," Miss Marple assured her, her eyes twinkling with a nostalgic light. "I was merely thinking of when we were girls. We built snowmen, you know, and skated on the duck pond until our fingers were quite numb. And the trains. When a train went through a tunnel, the boys would attempt all sorts of mischief." "Mischief?" Mrs. Chatton prompted, her voice a low, interested purr. Miss Marple nodded, allowing herself a small, conspiratorial smile. "Why, yes. It was a rather cheeky practice, you see, for a young man to attempt to steal a kiss in the sudden darkness. Of course," she added, her eyes twinkling brighter, "we were never entirely defenseless. We girls always had our hat pins." A ripple of laughter went through the room. "Good heavens!" exclaimed Mrs. Chatton with mock horror. "Hat pins as weapons!" "Oh, but of course," Miss Marple said serenely. "A sharp jab to an offending arm usually did the trick. A lady, after all, must always be prepared for the unexpected." The conversation drifted on, buoyed by this talk of childhood antics and old traditions, but Miss Marple, ever watchful, saw what lay beneath. Charles Weatherby's expression had darkened at some private thought. The Major, though he smiled when expected to, seemed to have retreated further into himself. But it was Violet Strickland who betrayed the true strain. Her fingers, which had been toying with her necklace, now gripped the pearls with a sudden, desperate tightness, as though she were holding on to a lifeline. Miss Marple catalogued each expression, each tiny, telling gesture, tucking them away for later consideration. The dinner bell chimed, a welcome interruption, and the guests made their way to the grand dining room. The table gleamed with silver and crystal, laid with an impressive feast of roast pheasant and glazed ham. Harriet, at the head of the table, beamed with pride. "Cook has quite outdone herself this year. I do hope everyone is hungry." The meal began with a performance of lively conversation, but the undercurrents remained. Charles barely touched his food. The Major was polite but distant. Soon the plates were cleared, port and sherry were poured, and a magnificent, brandy-laced Christmas pudding was brought in, wreathed in blue flames. But as the evening drew to a close, a certain restlessness settled over the party. Charles Weatherby was the first to excuse himself, muttering something about needing a breath of fresh air before quitting the room abruptly. The Major followed soon after, his wife trailing in his wake like a pale shadow. Mr. and Mrs. Chatton exchanged a single, indecipherable glance before they too retreated. Henry, tucking his book under his arm, wished everyone a quiet good night. Soon only Miss Marple and Harriet remained, the fire now burning low, its embers casting a warm but dying glow across the room. It was a lovely evening, wasn't it? Harriet sighed, content with her efforts. Miss Marple merely smiled. Yes, my dear. Quite. But as the house fell silent, the quiet seemed thick, heavy, and altogether unnatural. Outside, the storm had gathered its full strength, and the wind howled against the ancient stone walls of Weatherby Manor, like a hungry thing seeking entrance. Chapter 3: A Thief Among Us. Morning at Weatherby Manor arrived not with the gentle hush of snow-covered grounds, but with a sound that tore through the fragile quiet of the sleeping household, a sharp, piercing scream. It was a sound of genuine, unfeigned alarm, and Miss Marple, ever a light sleeper, was sitting bolt upright in bed before its echo had faded. She knew the difference between a startled cry and the ring of true panic. This was undoubtedly the latter. Doors creaked open along the corridor. Groggy figures emerged, clutching dressing gowns and blinking against the pale morning light that filtered through the landing window. Miss Marple, moving with a quiet efficiency that belied her years, stepped into the hallway just as Harriet Weatherby hurried past, a look of profound irritation on her face. Charles Weatherby trailed behind, his expression sour. Unnecessary dramatics, he muttered to no one in particular. The commotion emanated from the east wing, from the room belonging to Mrs. Strickland. By the time Miss Marple arrived, a small crowd had gathered at the threshold. Violet Strickland was the center of the tableau. She stood near her dressing table, one hand pressed to her chest, the other gesturing wildly towards its polished surface. Her face was ashen, her lips trembling. "My necklace," she gasped, her eyes darting between the faces gathered in the doorway. "The pearls? I wore them to dinner. I placed them right here. And now they're gone." Harriet Weatherby let out a long-suffering sigh. "Are you quite sure, Violet, dear? Perhaps in all the excitement you simply misplaced it." "No, I am not mistaken," Mrs. Strickland insisted, her voice rising with hysteria. She pointed a trembling finger at an empty, velvet-lined depression in her jewelry box. "I put it there myself before I went to bed. And now it has vanished." The guests exchanged uneasy glances. A missing item was one thing, an expensive pearl necklace, worn just hours before, was quite another. The servants were summoned at once. The little housemaid who had turned down Mrs. Strickland's bed swore she had not seen the necklace after her mistress had retired. The butler, a man of immense dignity who had served the Weatherbys for 20 years, stated calmly that he had not entered the room at all. A search began, at once frantic and futile. Maids shook out blankets and lifted cushions. The Major, his face a grim mask, methodically upturned his wife's handbag and emptied her traveling cases onto the bed, his movements stiff and precise. All the while, Miss Marple stood quietly by the door, her gaze missing nothing, not the way Mrs. Strickland's hand repeatedly flew to her throat, as though feeling for the phantom weight of her pearls, not the flicker of contempt on Charles Weatherby's face, nor the slight, almost imperceptible way young Henry kept himself apart from the search, watching, rather than participating. And then, just as it seemed the necklace had truly dissolved into thin air, came a discovery. One of the housemaids, searching the far corners of the room for a second time, let out a small cry. Her hand was trembling as she held out a small object. It was a length of broken white string. The room fell silent. The fine thread was frayed at the edges, as though an object of some weight had been roughly torn from it. "That," Violet Strickland's voice broke. "That is from my necklace." The air grew thick with a new and dreadful apprehension. "And where," Harriet asked, her voice dangerously quiet, "did you find this?" The housemaid hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. "In the corridor." just outside the door to the kitchens. Near the cook's room. A collective intake of breath. The cook, a stout, red-faced man who had been hovering anxiously by the door, turned a pasty shade of grey. "Me," he stammered, his hands twisting in his apron. "Oh, no, I swear it. I never touched the lady's pearls. Never." The Major took a step forward, his face like granite. "Then how do you explain this? Found practically on your doorstep." The cook's lips worked, but no sound came out. His entire career, his very character, was being dismantled before his eyes. It was then that Miss Marple finally spoke. Her voice, soft but distinct, cut through the heavy silence. "A very peculiar thing indeed," she murmured. All eyes turned to her. She was looking not at the terrified cook, nor at the accusatory Major, but at the piece of string itself, a thoughtful, calculating expression in her sharp blue eyes. "Peculiar indeed," she repeated softly. A simple theft, it seemed. A piece of evidence, conveniently damning. And yet, something about it felt distinctly arranged. Her gaze flickered for a brief second to Henry Strickland, who had resumed his silent observation from the corner of the room. She wondered, quite idly, what thrilling denouement the hero of his book might have made of all this. The storm outside continued to rage, the snow falling thick and fast, trapping them all inside. A thief was among them, it seemed. But Miss Marple had the distinct and unsettling impression that the matter was far from simple. Chapter 4: The Curious Nature of Theft. The snow continued to fall, a silent, implacable siege that had now entirely cut Weatherby Manor off from the outside world. The telephone lines, which had been unreliable the evening before, were now completely dead. Despite the morning's unsettling events, Harriet Weatherby had marshalled her household with the fortitude of a general, ensuring that a semblance of order was maintained. A missing necklace was a frightful business, of course, but Harriet had little patience for hysterics. Before the lines had failed, however, Charles had managed to get through to the local constabulary. The response was as expected. The inspector at Staplehurst was snowed in, but a village constable, a young man who lived not 2 miles distant, would make his way to the manor on foot. And so it was that 2 hours later, a stout, red-faced young man by the name of Constable Briggs stamped his snow-caked boots in the grand entrance hall, his cheeks glowing like apples. "Quite a storm, sir," he said to the butler, looking around with an air of profound respect. "Proper blizzard. Now then, about this spot of bother with a stolen necklace." He was led to the drawing-room, where the principal parties to the affair had been assembled. Major Strickland stood stiffly by the fire, his wife beside him, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. The cook, looking utterly wretched, had been brought in and stood twisting his cap in his hands near the door. Mr. and Mrs. Chatton observed the proceedings with a detached interest, while Miss Marple had taken her usual quiet seat, her hands resting peacefully in her lap. Constable Briggs, notebook in hand, listened with ponderous gravity to the accounts of the morning, the scream, the empty jewelry box, the frantic search, and the damning discovery of the broken string. He turned a sharp, official eye on the cook. "So you're saying you know nothing about it, is that right?" "I swear on my mother's grave, sir. I've served the family for 20 years. I'm no thief." Briggs scratched his chin, clearly unimpressed. "Well, it's mighty suspicious, found right by your quarters." "Mighty suspicious indeed." It was at this point that Miss Marple, who had been listening with an air of mild inquiry, spoke for the first time. "Suspicious, yes," she agreed softly. "And yet, there are 1 or 2 little points that are not entirely clear. To my mind, at least." The constable blinked at her, slightly taken aback. Miss Marple turned her placid gaze toward Major Strickland. "Major, it is a very valuable necklace, I believe you said?" "One of great sentimental value to Mrs. Strickland, of course, but also of a high monetary value." The Major gave a curt, affirmative nod. "Worth £10,000, at least." A soft murmur went through the room. Even in a house as grand as this, £10,000 was a sum to command respect. "How very distressing," Miss Marple murmured. "And was it, by any chance, insured?" There was a silence. It was not a long silence, but it was a palpable one. The Major's face, which had been a mask of grim resolve, seemed to harden. He cleared his throat. "No," he admitted gruffly. "The policy expired last month. I had not yet seen to its renewal." "Oh, dear," Miss Marple said, with a soft, sighing sound. She did not elaborate, but the atmosphere in the room had subtly shifted. Constable Briggs, oblivious to these undercurrents, grunted. "Bad luck, that. Still, strange for a thief to know that, eh?" "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "And one other small thing. A provenance. I suppose, for an item of such value, you have a receipt of purchase. Or perhaps a valuation for the original insurance policy." This time the pause was more noticeable. The Major's lips pressed together into a thin, bloodless line. His eyes were cold as ice. "We do not," he said, his voice clipped. "Curious," Miss Marple said, her tone no more than a gentle musing. Violet Strickland, who had been watching her husband with an expression of mounting anxiety, suddenly spoke, her voice tight. "What does any of that matter?" "My necklace has been stolen." "That is the point." "Oh, of course, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice full of sympathy. "But you must see, it is rather odd. A very valuable necklace. No insurance. No receipt. It is the sort of thing that makes one wonder." Major Strickland drew himself up to his full height. "Are you implying something, madam?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple said at once, giving him a kindly, almost apologetic smile. "Not at all. I am merely an old woman who finds things puzzling. One's mind does wander so." Charles Weatherby let out an audible scoff. "Well, whatever the case, I'd like this nonsense resolved. I won't have my Christmas ruined by a pilfering cook and a lost bauble." Mrs. Chatton gave a delicate, tinkling laugh. "Oh, but Charles, surely a touch of scandal is so much more exciting than plum pudding." Miss Marple, however, was no longer attending to the conversation. Her gaze had settled on Henry Strickland. The young man, silent throughout the entire exchange, was staring at a spot on the Persian rug, his expression unreadable. His hands were thrust deep into the pockets of his tweed jacket, and for the first time, Miss Marple noticed something curious. His fingers, hidden from view, were twitching, a small, restless movement. It was the gesture of a person whose mind was working very, very fast indeed. There was something here, she thought. Something far more complex than a simple theft. And Miss Marple, though she said nothing more, was quite determined to discover what it was. Chapter 5: A Novel Idea. The luncheon, a rather subdued affair of cold meats and pickles, had concluded, and the inhabitants of Weatherby Manor had gravitated back to the drawing-room as if drawn by some unspoken command. An uneasy truce seemed to have settled over the house. Constable Briggs, having exhausted his preliminary questions and finding himself utterly marooned by the snow, had accepted a cup of tea in the kitchen, leaving the gentry to their own strained society. Outside, the world was a silent, unending vista of white. The snow, which had fallen with such relentless fury, now lay in deep, sculptural drifts against the windows, muffling all sound and lending the grand room a curious, almost theatrical intimacy. The only sounds were the soft sigh and crackle of the logs in the great stone hearth and the relentless ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, measuring out the seconds of their enforced confinement. Miss Marple sat in her usual wing-back chair, her knitting needles clicking with a gentle, rhythmic purpose that was a counterpoint to the tension in the air. Her gaze, mild and blue, drifted over the assembled company. Harriet Weatherby, her brow furrowed in concentration, was making a poor show of tackling a crossword puzzle. Major Strickland stood ramrod straight by the mantelpiece, staring into the flames as though they held the answer to some profound military problem. On the chaise longue, Mr. and Mrs. Chat-Ton presented a study in contrasts, he, still and watchful, his long fingers steepled before him, she, languidly turning the pages of a society magazine, a faint, almost mocking smile playing on her lips. But it was on young Henry Strickland that Miss Marple's attention truly rested. The young man had sequestered himself in an armchair near the window, a book held so close to his face that he seemed to be inhaling its very words. He had been like that for the better part of an hour, a portrait of such profound absorption that it seemed just a little overdone. It was, Miss Marple thought, the sort of concentration a child affects when hoping to be ignored after some minor transgression. She allowed the silence to draw out for another minute before she set her knitting carefully aside in her lap. "It is a great comfort, a good book," she remarked to the room at large. Her voice, soft and a little reedy, cut through the quiet. "Especially when one is obliged to remain indoors. It quite takes one out of oneself." Harriet looked up from her puzzle, grateful for the distraction. "Oh, quite, Jane. Though I fear this crossword is proving rather more vexing than entertaining." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the young man by the window. "And you, Mr. Strickland," she said, her tone one of polite interest. "You seem to have found something most absorbing. A detective story, I believe you said earlier." Henry started, as if a pebble had been dropped into the still pool of his concentration. He looked up, his eyes blinking behind his spectacles. "Oh. Yes. That is to say, it is. I am so fond of them myself," Miss Marple continued, her hands folding placidly in her lap. "They are so very neat. Not like real life, which is always so untidy. And the plots, of course, can be most ingenious." She paused, a thoughtful frown touching her brow. "It reminds me, you know, of a little business we had in St. Mary Mead some years ago. Young Albert Pringle, the grocer's boy. He was always reading these penny dreadfuls, full of spies and nefarious schemes." Mrs. Chat-Ton lowered her magazine, a flicker of genuine amusement in her dark eyes. "Do tell us, Miss Marple. Did he find himself embroiled in international espionage?" "Oh, nothing so grand as that, my dear," Miss Marple said with a gentle smile. "No, it was a matter of the church collection plate. A 10-shilling note went missing, you see, and poor old Mrs. Higgins, who did the cleaning, was dreadfully upset. Everyone was so sure she must have taken it. Then, a few days later, Albert found the note tucked inside a hymn book. He was hailed as a hero." She let the little story hang in the air for a moment. "Of course," she added, her voice dropping slightly, "it all came out in the end. Young Albert had taken the note himself. He'd read a story about a clever boy detective who solves a theft that he himself had committed, all to make himself seem important. He staged the whole affair, from the theft to the convenient discovery. Such a silly, vain little plan. But then, vanity so often makes people foolish, does it not? A log collapsed in the fireplace, sending a shower of golden sparks up the chimney. In the sudden quiet that followed, the sound of Henry Strickland's breathing was unnervingly audible. He had not turned a page. His knuckles, where he gripped the spine of the book, were white. "An extraordinary coincidence," Mr. Chatton murmured, his voice smooth as silk. "Given our own little drama. Isn't it?" Miss Marple agreed, her gaze now fixed on Henry with an expression of benign curiosity. "It is so very interesting, is it not, how a story can put ideas into a person's head? A blueprint, you might say, for all sorts of behavior." Henry snapped the book shut with a crack that made everyone jump. He rose to his feet so abruptly that he stumbled, his face pale and slick with a fine sheen of perspiration. I think I'll get some air," he stammered, avoiding everyone's eyes. "My dear boy," Harriet exclaimed, "you can't possibly. The snow is up to the window sills." Just in the hall," he mumbled, pushing a hand through his already disheveled hair. "It's frightfully stuffy in here." Without another word, he strode from the room, his footsteps echoing with undue haste on the polished floorboards of the corridor. The heavy oak door swung shut behind him, leaving a profound and telling silence in his wake. Mrs. Chatton raised a perfectly shaped eyebrow. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with amusement, "I do believe someone has a guilty conscience." Miss Marple retrieved her knitting from her lap. The needles began their soft, rhythmic clicking once more. "Perhaps," she murmured, her eyes on the pattern taking shape between her fingers. "Or perhaps he is merely a young man who has just realized that fiction, my dear, is a very different thing from fact." Chapter 6: The Garden Clue. The storm had eased by late afternoon, its fury spent. A heavy, grey light now filtered through the tall windows, illuminating a world buried in deep, unblemished snow. Inside Weatherby Manor, however, the atmosphere remained leaden, charged with the unsaid and the suspected. Miss Marple, who had spent the better part of an hour in quiet contemplation, her knitting lying untouched in her lap, finally set her needles aside with an air of decision. She looked up, her expression mild but thoughtful, and turned to her hostess. "My dear Harriet," she said gently, "if you and your guests would be so kind, I believe I may have something of interest to show you all." Harriet, though perplexed, trusted her old friend's instincts. "Of course, Jane. What is it?" With a surprising agility, Miss Marple rose to her feet. She did not move towards the fireplace or the anxious group of guests, but towards the large bay window that overlooked the snow-laden gardens. Beside it, sitting unobtrusively on a small wooden stand, was a large potted fern, a sturdy, well-kept specimen with deep green fronds spilling over the rim of its ceramic container. The guests, murmuring amongst themselves, followed her, forming a loose and curious semicircle. Major Strickland stood stiffly, his face unreadable, his wife, Violet, clutched at the empty space on her throat where her pearls should have been. Henry Strickland remained towards the back of the group, his hands buried deep in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the floor. Miss Marple knelt beside the plant. Without a moment's hesitation, she pushed her small, gloved fingers into the cool, damp soil at its base. The room was utterly silent, save for the faint rustle of leaves as she began to gently sift through the dark earth. The assembled onlookers exchanged puzzled, almost embarrassed glances, but no one dared to speak. Then, after a few moments, Miss Marple's fingers closed around something small and hard. Carefully, she lifted her hand, letting the loose soil fall away. A single, perfect pearl gleamed in the dim afternoon light. A sharp, collective gasp went through the room. Harriet Weatherby took an involuntary step forward, while Mrs. Strickland's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Miss Marple, undeterred, continued her search. Within moments she retrieved another pearl, then another, and another. Slowly, methodically, she let them fall into her open palm, where they lay nestled together like tiny, luminous beads of moonlight. A stunned silence followed. But how? Major Strickland finally managed, his voice hoarse. His usually composed demeanor had faltered, his brows knitting together in utter confusion. Miss Marple rose, dusting the soil from her gloves with a handkerchief she had retrieved from her sleeve. She looked up at the circle of astonished faces, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "My dear friends," she said softly, "I do not believe there ever was a theft." Violet Strickland blinked. "But my necklace?" "Your necklace, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "was never stolen. It was broken." A new hush fell over the room, one of understanding beginning to dawn. "Someone," Miss Marple continued, her gaze moving deliberately from face to face, quite deliberately snapped the strand, removed the pearls, and concealed them here in this fern pot, just before the household awoke. "And I rather think I know why." All eyes were fixed on her, waiting. "The necklace," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room, "was never worth £10,000, was it, Major?" The Major stiffened as if he had been struck. I beg your pardon." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Oh, it was a pretty thing, I am sure. Quite lovely. But it was not a valuable antique. It was a simple string of cultured pearls. And that, of course, is why you had no receipt. It is why there was no insurance to be renewed. It was an ordinary piece of jewelry, dressed up for a rather elaborate performance." Violet Strickland looked at her husband, bewilderment and a new, dawning horror in her eyes. "Edward? Is that true?" Major Strickland's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He simply stared at the pearls in Miss Marple's hand. Miss Marple then turned her attention to Henry, who had remained conspicuously silent at the back of the group. "You dear boy," she said, her voice softened with a note of pity, "have a great appreciation for detective novels, do you not? Full of clever plots and ingenious deceptions." Henry's face remained impassive, but his fingers twitched at his sides. "I suspect," Miss Marple continued, "that one such novel gave you an idea. A rather interesting one, but not, I am afraid, quite as clever as you believed it to be. You broke the necklace yourself, did you not? You hid the pearls here in this pot, and you dropped the broken string in the corridor to ensure that suspicion would fall upon an innocent man." A choked gasp came from Harriet, while Violet let out a small, wounded cry. Miss Marple's expression remained serene. "A rather clever trick," she finished softly. "But a rather foolish and cruel one, too." Henry's lips parted slightly, as if to protest, but no words came. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, waiting for a confession that now seemed inevitable. The truth had been unearthed, quite literally, and all that remained was for the guilty parties to speak. Chapter 7: The Real Culprits. The silence in the drawing-room was so profound that one could hear the soft hiss of a dying ember in the grate. The scattered pearls in Miss Marple's palm seemed to hold the last of the day's light. Henry Strickland stood frozen, a statue of youthful folly, his mouth half open as if to speak a protest his mind could not formulate. It was Harriet Weatherby who finally broke the spell, her voice a bewildered whisper. "But, Jane, why? Why on earth would Henry do such a thing? To frame an innocent man, to cause his own mother such distress? It makes no sense." Miss Marple sighed, a soft, regretful sound, and carefully placed the pearls upon a small side table. "Ah, my dear Harriet," she said, her tone that of a schoolmistress patiently explaining a simple but vital point. "That is, if you will forgive me, entirely the wrong question. The right question is not why Henry did it. It is, who truly stood to benefit from this elaborate little play? Her sharp, blue eyes left the distressed figure of the boy and settled, with unnerving placidity, upon her host, Charles Weatherby. "Charles," she said, her voice quite conversational. "You mentioned the Chat-Tuns were old friends of yours." Charles, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mixture of irritation and grim satisfaction, shifted uneasily. He cleared his throat, avoiding her direct gaze. "Well, not old friends, precisely. Acquaintances." "Indeed." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose a fraction. "And these acquaintances, they were quite insistent on being invited for Christmas, were they not?" Harriet mentioned it. "A very last-minute arrangement." The room, already on edge, seemed to hold its breath. Mrs. Chat-Tun, who had been observing the proceedings with a stiff, unnatural poise, sat up a little straighter. Her husband, usually so languid, so composed, had become rigid. Miss Marple's hand settled in her lap. A faint, knowing smile touched the corners of her lips. "Oh, I think you know what I am suggesting, do you not, Mrs. Chat-Tun?" she said, her voice still gentle. "Your husband seems to. Would you care to explain, or shall I?" The challenge hung in the air, delicate yet unbreakable. Evelyn Chat-Tun swallowed, the color draining from her face. She turned to her husband, her breath shallow, but he offered no support. His watchful eyes were fixed on Miss Marple, and in them was the cold, flat light of defeat. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, quite suddenly, Mr. Chat-Tun let out a long, slow sigh, the sound of a game finally lost. His shoulders slumped. "It's no use, Evelyn," he said, his voice devoid of all its earlier smoothness. "She knows." A collective murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Chat-Tun inhaled sharply, then let out a bitter little laugh that held no trace of humor. She straightened in her seat, smoothing the folds of her expensive dress with slow, deliberate hands, her composure a magnificent, brittle ruin. "Well," she said, her voice tight, "I suppose we must give credit where it is due. Very clever, Miss Marple." "You mean to say," Harriet whispered, her voice incredulous, "that this was all planned?" "Of course it was planned," Mrs. Chat-Tun snapped, her elegance now sharpened to a cutting edge. "The pearls were paste, naturally. Worthless. That part was simply to create the scene. A bit of misdirection for the audience." "Quite so," Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "The idea, I presume, was to create an incident so dramatic, so embarrassing, that Major Strickland would be forced to offer some sort of compensation. A man of his honor, a retired military officer, could hardly allow a guest's valuable jewelry to be stolen under his roof. He would be eager to avoid a police investigation and a scandal. A quiet payout, perhaps, to make the whole unpleasant business go away. We might have succeeded, too," Mrs. Chat-Tun said, casting a look of pure venom at Henry, "if our young accomplice hadn't been so transparently guilty." "You preyed upon him," Major Strickland said, his voice low and shaking with rage. "You discovered our financial difficulties. You saw his foolish obsession with those books, and you manipulated him. We merely offered him a role in a thrilling real-life drama," Mr. Chat-Tun countered dryly. "He was a most willing participant." Constable Briggs, who had been lingering near the doorway with an expression of ever-increasing bewilderment, suddenly straightened, his presence now an official one. He stepped forward, removing a small, dog-eared notebook from his tunic. I'll be needing you both to come with me," he said, his voice firming with newfound authority. Mr. Chat-Tun exhaled again but made no protest. His wife, however, rose to her feet, smoothing her dress one last time. "Well," she said with a final, sardonic smile that encompassed the entire room, "one can't say it hasn't been a memorable Christmas." And with that, the real culprits were taken into custody, leaving behind them a wrecked holiday and a family with its own difficult truths to face. Chapter 8: A Very Marple Christmas. With the departure of the Chattons, a profound quiet settled over Weatherby Manor. It was not the tense, watchful silence of the morning, but one of exhaustion and relief, as though the house itself were breathing a long, slow sigh. The constable, having taken his notes and offered his profound thanks to Miss Marple, had departed soon after, promising that the inspector would follow up with further questions once the roads were cleared. There was, however, no real doubt about the case now. The Chattons had played their hand and lost, their clever scheme undone not by police procedure but by an old lady's quiet understanding of human nature. The first order of business for Harriet Weatherby, her composure restored, was to make her way to the kitchens. The cook, who had spent the day under a dark cloud of suspicion, was standing by a work table, staring blankly at a row of potatoes. Harriet placed a hand gently on his arm. "Cook," she said, her voice full of genuine remorse, "I am so very, very sorry. We were all quite horrid to you." The poor man waved it off, though a faint flush of relief colored his cheeks. "It's always the servants, who are looked to first when something goes missing," he said, not with bitterness, but with the weary acceptance of long experience. "I'm just glad the truth of it came out." He then straightened his shoulders, his professional pride reasserting itself. "Now, if you'll excuse me, there is a Christmas feast to prepare. And I intend to make it a proper one." In the drawing-room, the fire had been stoked, casting a warm, forgiving glow across the dark wood paneling. Miss Marple sat in her usual chair, a delicate cup of tea resting on the saucer in her lap. The Stricklands were gathered near the hearth, a tableau of quiet reconciliation. The Major, looking as though he had aged 10 years in a single afternoon, entered the room and went to his wife's side. "I've spoken to Henry," he said gravely. "He's ashamed of himself. Terribly so. I don't think he truly understood the consequences. To him, it was a game, a chapter out of one of his books. He never really believed an innocent man would suffer." Violet gave a small, sad sigh and clasped her husband's hand. "Perhaps," she said softly, "it is a lesson he needed to learn. A very hard one." Miss Marple nodded approvingly from her chair. "Indeed. And if I may say so, Major, you may find it helpful to encourage Henry to direct his interest in such stories toward more productive means. A sharp mind is a valuable thing, after all, when it is used for good." The Major managed a wry, tired smile. "Perhaps you're right, Miss Marple. Though I think we'll be keeping a closer watch on his reading material for a time." Later, as the afternoon wore on, Harriet sat opposite her old friend, shaking her head in lingering disbelief. "To think, Jane! I invited criminals into my home. At Christmas!" "You mustn't blame yourself, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "They were very convincing. And they preyed upon the natural hospitality of the season. You had no way of knowing their true intentions." "But you did," Harriet said. "How did you see it?" Miss Marple smiled and stirred her tea. "Oh, it wasn't terribly difficult. People, my dear Harriet, are much the same everywhere, whether they are in a grand house like this or in my little village of St. Mary Mead. The Chattons were a little too polished, a little too eager to please. And the Major was trying far too hard to be the victim of a great misfortune. When people are not what they seem, they generally overact the part." The evening passed in a much lighter mood. With the weight of suspicion lifted, the household began to relax. The dining room, when they all gathered for the meal, was a triumphant sight. The cook had indeed outdone himself. A magnificent roast turkey sat in the center of the table, surrounded by all the traditional trimmings, and the scent of warm mince pies and mulled wine filled the air. There was laughter again, and conversation that did not carry a heavy undercurrent of uncertainty. Even Charles Weatherby seemed to have softened. As he stood to carve the turkey, he cleared his throat and looked down the table. "Well," he said gruffly, a statement which for him amounted to a lengthy speech. "I suppose we can thank Miss Marple for saving Christmas." A round of agreement murmured through the guests. Miss Marple smiled but shook her head modestly. "Oh, my dear Charles, I did nothing of the sort," she said. "Christmas was always here. You just had to clear away a bit of deception to see it properly." A round of toasts followed, and as the fire crackled in the background, it truly felt like Christmas once more. The storm outside had passed, and in its wake, the household at Weatherby Manor had found a renewed sense of warmth, not just from the hearth, but from the company they kept. As Miss Marple sat back in her chair, watching the happy scene unfold, she allowed herself the smallest of smiles. It had been, she thought, a rather interesting Christmas after all.